Well, welcome everybody to episode 2 of the 6 Inches of Soil podcast, which we're calling Unrefined Grain Gains. To get this going today, I thought we'd go round the world and introduce yourself. So one by one, I'll come to you, and perhaps you could tell the audience who you are and specifically where you fit in the grain supply chain. So Anna, starting with you.
Yeah, so I'm a farmer in North Lincolnshire in the UK, and we have about 1,000 acres with a little flock of sheep, and then we also borrow sheep as well. So I fit in because we basically supply grain, so we harvest it and we supply it locally. All of our grain goes around the UK, and we're also changing up our grain a little bit, which we'll obviously talk about. But yeah, that's how I fit in.
Love it. And
I also produced a film called 6 Inches of Soil, which if you're listening to this podcast, you probably already know about and hopefully have watched it. But I was one of the 3 people in the film who was a new farmer, basically.
yeah, we'll definitely dive into that deeper. I love that. What about you, Tim? Where do you fit in?
So I'm a farm manager in South Staffordshire. We're a 300 hectare farm. I try to farm as biologically and nutritionally as possible. So I don't use fungicides, I don't use insecticides, very few herbicides, and I get nitrogen down as low as I can. Nitrogen's done so much damage to our soil and so much damage to human health. I try to produce high yields of very limited nitrogen, so I've been as low as 50 kilos to the hectare of nitrogen. I'm also a co-founder of the Green Farm Collective, where a group of us have come together to trade carbon, biodiversity, and more recently we've got genuine regen produce that we're trying to get into the market to produce flour to send on, because it's more nutrition rich, far better product. You can heal the planet while you're buying the food, and we are what we eat. So it's a no-lose situation for the consumer buying into that, because they can buy into the story of regenerative agriculture and taste the difference at the same time.
Yeah, very true. Staying in the UK, how about you, Bertie? Where do you fit into the grain supply chain?
So, I'm Bertie Matthews. I'm a flour miller. We have a flour mill in the Cotswolds, and we produce about 30,000 tonnes of flour from about 35,000 tonnes of grain each year. And that comes from about 150 farms. And over the last 5 years, we've been working with some farmers farming in a regenerative way using regenerative standards. So that's our objective over the next 5 to 10 years plus, to increase the amount of regen farmers that we're working with.
Very important. And now, how about we're going to go over the pond to Mr. Rick Clark. Where do you fit into the grain supply chain?
Hi there, Rick Clark, West Central Indiana, USA. We have been on a regenerative journey for about 18 years, and we are primarily a row crop farmer that raises corn, soybeans, wheat, alfalfa, peas, milo, buckwheat, cover crops, cattle, and sheep. And we are trying to fit in to where we supply those inputs to the next process for either animal consumption or products to be milled for food grade products for human consumption. So we're on both sides of the feed and the food spectrum.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for that. And thank you so much for joining us today. And Valerie, where do you fit into things?
Hi, I'm Valerie with Maker's Mark. We distill all of this great agriculture, and a lot of folks don't think about bourbon as an agricultural product, but we have very close partnerships with our grain growers. We are currently supporting them in the education, soil verification, and certification for their regenerative agriculture journey. And the Maker's Mark Distillery sits on an 1,100 acre working farm called Star Hill Farm, where we're trying to model out what regenerative agriculture looks like from, all of the many benefits, but most importantly, messaging on the flavor benefits of regenerative agriculture.
Yeah, that's so important. Now, before we start properly, Anna, to come back to you, I noticed that you're a human woman grain farmer. Are you an endangered species, and what's that been like?
I am indeed. Yes, yes. It has its moments for sure. Today, oh no, it wasn't today. Last week, a we had a delivery and they came in and they said, "Oh, can I have the farmer unload this, please?" And I obviously told him who the farmer was, but yeah, it didn't go down very well. But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, we are an endangered species, but we're growing, and that's really good. And there are more of us. But I think, yeah, I think we will get there as women, and we just need a few more opportunities.
Yeah, well, thank you for being one of the leading lights in that space. I'm going to start with a couple of quotes. The first quote says, consumers need to know that they can create change simply with their purchasing of good, healthy products. That quote comes from Nana Clark, Rick's long-suffering wife. And the other quote is from Mr. Tim Parton, which is people have got so far removed from where the food comes from, they just think they go to the store and they buy food. So I think a good place to start this conversation is at the consumer end of this. And so, Valerie, perhaps you could explain to us when a consumer is buying bourbon, exactly how is it connected to farming and like what does regenerative bourbon mean and why should they care about that?
Yeah, so I would say the awareness of regenerative bourbon or the expectation of regenerative bourbon is probably next to zero right now. I think regenerative and, from a food sourcing standpoint, I think consumers have higher expectations and more awareness of. And like I said, we stumbled into really regenerative agriculture, just trying to pursue, how do we maximize the flavor of our bourbon? And, started working with experts just to understand where flavor comes from, how much flavor from our flavoring grain wheat, which a lot of whiskeys, bourbons are made with a flavoring grain of rye. So, is the grain the same as it was when Bill and Margie, our co-founders, created Maker's Mark? And, what we learned in that process is due to conventional farming, farming had become about yield versus flavor. And so just unpacking then, where does flavor comes from nutrient dense grain, which comes from nutrient dense soil, which comes from, how do you increase the nutrients in the soil? It's all of these aspects of regenerative. So, we're just starting this journey of connecting with, our drinkers, the importance of regenerative agriculture. And we know, and we've seen that it leads to a more flavorful bourbon when you're implementing these practices. So I think it's a new thing. I think it's for spirits, especially. Consumers have no expectation, and like I said, quite honestly, don't associate distilled spirits as coming from agriculture. So that's a learning education for our consumers. But when we share that connection that we have with our corn and wheat growers that are within a 40-mile radius of the Maker's Mark distillery, and, the journey that they're on, when we share with them how to unlock flavor through regenerative agriculture and really just think about spirits in a different way, it's like this light bulb moment for folks. So while we're distilling a Regenified certified distillate every day, so all of our corn and wheat, 86% of our mash bill is coming from farms that are certified Regenified. We won't be able to claim that on our label for another 6 years because of the long maturation process of bourbon. But our hope is that if a brand like Maker's Mark that will hand dip 29 million bottles this year can make this transition, then that gives us 6 years to really educate the consumer on the importance of buying brands that are practicing in this way, because, you know, Maker's Mark is quite passionate about this must be the way forward for agriculture. And can we use our megaphone as a consumer product to educate folks on knowing their farmer, knowing where their food comes from, purchasing brands that are practicing in this way, because we believe this is the future.
And presumably, I hope anyway, listeners may be surprised to learn that a brand as massive as Maker's Mark, which is global, is able to use 100% regeneratively grown grains. But do you want to go into a little bit like what impact you hope to make in the regenerative world? Because I think that's really interesting for people to learn and understand.
Yeah, so we're hoping that Maker's Mark, like you said, you know, a big brand like Maker's Mark, if we can convert our supply chain to regeneratively grown and certified, that this is, you know, we can prove out that this model can work. It's not easy. It's quite difficult. It's a transition, but how do we, if we can do this, you know, then others in our industry should be able to do this as well. In the United States alone, there are over 2,800 distilleries. Can you imagine the amount of agriculture that's supplying just the U.S. distilleries? And so beyond our industry, though, we know that restaurants are a source for change. Restaurants are where culture is changed. It's where stories are told. And often, you know, many of these restaurants that we partner with have a direct relationship with ranchers and farmers. You know, they are sourcing from local farms because they care about the traceability and the transparency of the ingredients that they're serving in their restaurants. And they have good intentions. I think, like all farmers, you know, wanting to do the right thing for business and for the land. And so what Maker's Mark is committing to do is, can we transform agriculture that is supplying the restaurant community globally? Can we provide the educational resources, the soil verification? So let's measure impact over time, not just to the soil, but to farmer profitability. Can we prove out a model that says, you know, this can be profitable and we can feed people in a nutrient way, you know, with high nutrients, that's also in benefit to the planet. So what we would like to do is identify, you know, those local farmers that are supplying some of the most influential, most storytelling bars and restaurants globally with that education for regenerative agriculture. And then, you know, let the restaurants and the farmers really speak to the patrons of those accounts about the benefits that they're seeing, the flavor benefits, the nutrient benefits, and all of the other, you know, wonderful aspects and outcomes that regenerative agriculture provides.
Yeah.
So,
And maybe coming to one of the farmers, Rick, would you talk on why would Valerie's bourbon have more flavor and more nutrients if it's coming from a regenerative system?
Yeah, I first of all, I kudos to Maker's Mark for being the first one to dive off the deep end. We appreciate that. It takes a leader.
Oh, have we lost Rick? Yeah. Well, let's put the question to you, Tim. So I'll re-ask that. So, Tim, Valerie there talked about flavor and how that affects the bourbon. Why would that be different if it's coming from a regenerative farm instead of conventionally farmed grains?
The main difference, Richard, is we're not moving the soil, so we're getting that symbiosis between the plant and the biology within the soil. So the fungi, they're connecting. So the mycorrhizal fungi is connecting with that plant, bacteria is connecting with that plant, and it's feeding the plant exactly what it needs. So that plant is nutritionally balanced. It's got all that nutrition pumping in there, so it should be a bigger plant. It's photosynthesizing more. It's capturing all that carbon, turning that carbon into sugars, feeding the biology, and that's what's pumping all that flavour in. And that's where we've lost that connection to Mother Earth as a human race, because we've been pumping the soil for all these drugs, ignoring the biology, and now we're going back to basics and having that biology work for us. I always think last century was the chemical century. This century has got to be the biological century, so we can start and save this beautiful planet in which we're all privileged to live and breathe. And that's the difference why we're packing all this flavour into that food, is because we've got those connections.
Yeah, I love that. And Rick, Tim there mentioned about chemistry versus biology. Do you want to talk a little bit more about that and how farming has changed in that regard?
The way I'm farming now, I'm using biology and I'm using nutrition, where if you'd have asked me probably 30 years ago, I was a full chemical farmer. And I always use the analogy now, if I'd got 2 plates of sandwiches, one was the conventional farmer where you had all the active chemicals that had been applied to that growing crop to make that flour, to make that bread. And you've got my plate of sandwiches, which has just had that nutrition and natural biology to create that wholesome natural product. You know which plate of sandwiches people are going to go and pick up, because why would you want to put those chemicals into your body? And to me, it's no surprise that as we've increased all these synthetics going onto our food and onto the soil, human health has gone down. We are what we eat. And it's time for the public out there to understand how we can produce food. Come with us on this journey, be part of the journey, invest in us. If it's 10 pence or more for a loaf of bread, that's got to be worth it to play your part in healing this planet. The planet we live in is dying, and it's time we've got to reverse that. Time is running out. It's time that we all pulled together, talk to the farmers and talk to the consumers. We're all in this together. None of us can live without each other. It's the farmers, to me, are the heroes of the world, because we're the ones that can capture carbon. We can improve air, we can improve soil, and we can improve water quality. There's nothing not to like. We should be applauding in what we're doing, but invest in us and come with us on the journey. It's all part of it.
Yeah, no, I fully agree. By the way, one question I forgot to ask Valerie to you is, can you explain to me what the difference is between bourbon and whiskey? I've always wondered that.
I
Key
think
question.
that's a different podcast, Richard. But bourbon has just different standards than whiskey has. So all bourbon is whiskey, but not all whiskey is bourbon. I think that would be a good distinction.
And one of our listeners, Mary in Toronto, asks, is the gluten in whiskey or is the gluten in bourbon? And how do you judge a good pure bourbon?
Yeah, so there's our bourbon is gluten-free. That high distillation and long maturation takes the gluten out of the whiskey. You still get all the flavor from the grain, but that goes away.
Okay, got it. Well, thank you for that. So Bertie, coming on to you, how do you get involved in regenerative agriculture? Why is it important to you and the flour and the products that you produce? Can you tell us a little bit more about that? Because it'd be really interesting to learn why you do that, but maybe other millers don't.
Yeah, no, really good question. And I think following on from what Tim was saying, most flour millers would just be buying your normal group 1 to 4 wheats in the 60s, 70s and 80s. And it's about security of supply, and it would have been about price and obviously the quality of that grain. In America and Canada, you're blessed with some brilliant soils and some very cold winters and very hot summers. And your wheat is nice and high in protein, and in the UK it's not so much. So that quality element is a really important factor in any flour miller's decision. My father went into organic in the late 80s, and the regenerative mission is just a sort of next step of that for us. And I think we have decided to really put all of our effort into it for a number of key reasons. One is the security of supply. We want to keep buying from the farms that we're working with in 5, 10 and 20 years' time. So for them having more resilient soils in the UK and elsewhere in the world, that's really vital. Two for us is that, okay, we can buy conventional, that's great, but what can we do that's actually moving the ball forward for the food system? Because we're in that middle part of the chain, farmer, miller or producer, and then consumer. So looking at the regen grains that we can get from regen farms, it's going to be really beneficial from a nutrition point of view, but also from a biodiversity, sustainability, whatever you want to call it, point of view. So our objective, and Valerie was talking about this over a 5-year period, is in 5 to 10 years' time, what do we classify as success? So one, how many acres of regenerative farmland have we bought from in a particular year? What has happened to soil fertility on those farms in that time? What has happened to the amount of carbon that has been sequestered? What has happened to biodiversity? What has happened to water quality, cleanliness, infiltration? And what's happened to food security and yield security? So we've got to measure all of these things to prove that actually this is having a benefit. Regenerative agriculture is having a benefit to the farmers' businesses as well as their soils, and ultimately into the products and flowers that we create.
Yeah, I love that. And Tim, maybe you could talk on that a bit. I mean, Bertie's talking about nutrition again. What steps are you doing to explore that? Because you've obviously got a key role in this.
Well, I do an awful lot of SAP testing, which is basically exactly the same as us having a blood test. I treat all my crops as if they're pristine athletes, and I want them to go the full hog and give me the best yield they can. So I'm SAP testing to always see that that plant is nutritionally balanced all the way through, and then I'm only applying mainly through foliars. Foliars are far more efficient than doing soil applied applications. So it means that I can apply a lot less and get the same results. So I'm still getting the best yields. I mean, the best yield I've done is 12 tonnes to the hectare, which is just fantastic because we've got a growing population, so I'm still feeding the planet. But at the same time, I'm giving people more nutritious food, and that's what they should have the right to.
Yeah, I think that's really important. And Bertie, to come back to you. So if a consumer is in the bread aisle or choosing, what kind of biscuits to buy, what kind of things do you want them to be looking out for? And specifically, I've actually got a question here from Annie Tufton, my long-suffering wife. All of our wives are long-suffering, apparently, that's how I introduce them. And she asked, what does it actually mean to be gluten intolerant? And does that intolerance differ based on how the wheat is grown, or indeed what variety of wheat is used? So if you answer that question first, Bertie, then perhaps we'll come on to Rick to talk about that.
Thank you for that enormous question. I'm going to have to be so careful with that. I think for people that are gluten intolerant, they do have to be careful if it is a medical condition. Of course they do. And there are other variants out there. And I will use the phrase that there is potential to say that possibly the way that we have been farming over the last 50, 60 years has potentially not made that situation for those people better, or has led to more of these cases. I'm not going to say it has or it hasn't, but if you look at the amount of chemicals that we've been using over the last 50 to 70 years, it's perhaps no surprise that there are more of these issues people are having. And if you look at the work that brilliant farmers like Tim and his colleagues and the farmers that we use here at Matthews, look at the amount of reduction they're having on the chemical inputs onto their farms. I'm sure Tim can talk more about that. That can only be good for health, as well as the nutrition of the grain itself. So that's going to be a key factor going forward.
Yeah, and by the way, just before we come on to you, Rick, Anna, I was going to ask you, one of the things in the film was that you were still trying to work out where your grains were going to and trying to keep the identity preserved of those grains all the way through to a consumer. I was curious to learn more about how, can you give us updates on that?
Yeah, it's actually been surprisingly hard. So as a farmer, you contact lots of people saying, "We've got really good grain, would you like to buy our grain? Like, we've got great grain, would you like to buy it?" And a lot of people say no or don't reply to you, or I've even tried tweeting, well, Xing, um Bertie, I haven't
I'm
actually
right
messaged
here.
you.
We'll come and pick it up if you want. In fact, I'm going to put an offer to you right now. I'm sure we'll be able to use it in something, and then we can send it to a bakery or a food business and tell them exactly which farm it's come from. I'll send you my
Okay,
number
well,
after this.
Bertie, you've got a deal. But we do have soft sweets, so you actually might like that too. But yeah, we can definitely talk. But apart from Bertie, there isn't many people that have given me replies. However, Wild Farms have. So we are growing soft wheat, which is an 11-way blend, which we are now obviously going to sell to Bertie. And then we've also got Wild Farmed, which is we they work a little bit differently, and they're using sort of different grains to what we would use normally. And there's other. If I was to talk about how it all works, I would go on forever. But basically, we now know where our wheat is going, which is quite exciting, really. And we can also in fact, I think all of our crops now are companion cropping as well. So that works out really well. Companion cropping is basically where you have two crops in one field. And if it was me personally, I'd have like 5 crops in one field. But that would give Dad a heart attack, so I can't do that. So we're just going slowly with 2 for now, and then we're gonna slowly increase it. But yeah, we now have a route, and we know where it's going, which is really great. And actually, what I was going to say was our soft wheat, our 11-way blend, that was currently still going into the system, so we didn't know where that was ending up, but now it could end up with Bertie, so this could be a win-win.
Yeah, well, you guys are welcome. This is a matchmaking podcast as well, apparently.
Yes.
So what about you, Rick, in the big scary world of America? How have you approached trying to keep your grains separate to try to add value to your business?
Yeah, it takes a lot of effort. It takes a lot of work. You have to try to align yourself with either people or companies, organizations that have the same vision that you have. For example, we are certified through a company called Regenerative, and that now not only that, but we're also organically certified. So it opens up a lot of avenues, and it puts you in touch with people that you may or may not have had that ability to do. So, and a lot of this is your own due diligence. You need to get the fire under your butt, and you need to get out, and you need to get the word out, and get people to see your product and see the value in your product. So it's hard, though. I mean, we've got an online retail meat service that is not doing near what I think it should be doing. Um, and that's okay. I mean, that's why we vertically integrate. We don't put all of our eggs in one basket. We try to have several revenue streams, and because of that, then if one doesn't come through like you think it should, then the others can carry the load. So it's all about being diverse. I think, in my opinion, of the 6 principles of soil health, diversity is number one. And it doesn't just mean diversity of cover crops, it's diversity of everything, your life, what you do, the people you talk to. All of these things will help determine your success into the future.
Yeah, and you touched on organic, and you were also talking about regenerative. And I think in a consumer's mind, it is a little bit confusing what those two terms mean and stand for.
Yeah.
Do you want to just kind of explain the differences and the nuances between those two
Yeah.
things?
Yeah, in my opinion, and these are my opinions that I'm going to give here now. You do not need to be organic to be regenerative. That's, in my opinion, a misnomer. You can be regenerative and then become organic, or you can be separate, or you can be both. And we decided to go down the organic road for many reasons, but two of the main reasons were soil health and human health. And when you couple those two together, you then grow a product that, like Maker's Mark, will want to consume or want to purchase, because then they understand that that product is going to have a different flavor profile than a grain that is a genetically modified grain, or even a grain that's a non-GMO that's grown in a high fertility environment. So once you get companies like Maker's Mark that understand that and are willing to step out and pay and again, Valerie, I don't want to speak for your company. I assume you're paying a premium to your farmers. I'm making an assumption there. But that is what the farmer needs, because so many times, Richard, what's happening is, the farmers, and we just heard it just a little bit ago. The farmers are out working hard. They're getting these certifications, and they're not getting any premium for their product. So that right there is a big roadblock for anybody. When I say anybody, I mean a farmer wanting to change their practices, because in their opinion, they should be receiving a premium to make those adjustments.
Yeah, but what about, so that's talking about where the grains are going and the meat. What about your costs? I mean, do you want to talk a little bit?
Yeah.
And I'll come on to you, Tim, in a sec with a similar question. But Rick, do you want to talk about your costs as you've gone from conventional to organic to regenerative?
Yeah. That is where I really focus in on. I don't focus on yield. I don't focus on, this is not a yield game. This is a profitability game. This is a return on investment game. So when you look at where we've come from, we have reduced diesel fuel by almost 60% on this farm. We have taken all of our inputs to zero. We no longer buy fertilizer. We don't buy nitrogen. We don't buy phosphorus. We don't buy potassium. We don't buy any of those things. We have pretty much taken our input costs to almost zero, except for the things that you have to have, and we're slowly trying to get rid of that. Right now, our farm is saving about $2.7 or $2.8 million in input costs. So when you look at that, as now you then go to the end game and you start to line up your yield goals or your yield expectations, or you look at what your true yields really are, you now no longer need to have a home run of yield to be profitable, because we've taken all the inputs away on the front side. Now, all of that is nice and sounds like lollipops and candy canes, but it's not, because it's very hard to raise row crops with no tillage, no chemistry, no anything. So we have to be very careful here, Richard, about how we present this message. If we want to move the masses, if we want to move the farming community masses, is it going to be a system that looks like ours? Probably not today, but it's going to be a blend of some kind of a system that is heading toward the total reduction of inputs. Now, I don't see anything wrong with the farm that has done no reductions to then move to a goal of 50% reduction. That's huge. That is a victory, in my opinion. So we got to sometimes be careful that we don't look at this just as black and white. And if we don't get everyone to go 100% no inputs, it's not going to be successful. I don't look at it that way. I mean, if you look at just the United States, we've got about 900 million acres here that we can farm. If we were to reduce the inputs on half of those acres, that's 450 million acres. That is a bunch of acres. So that's how I look at that, Richard. So, but to answer your question, our inputs have gone to almost zero, and now the last thing that we've done to one of the last things that we have done that we need to pay for would be seed, and we're slowly working ourselves out of that, because I don't know how many folks know about what we're doing, but I'm really big into epigenetics, and we are legally making our own soybean varieties. We're legally making our own corn hybrids, and we're making our own cereal grains, and all of these things. And we're also making our own biology. I heard Tim talk a lot about biology, and I totally agree. I think if you have a systematic regenerative approach to farming, you should have a systematic biological approach running parallel to that same system. And when you do things like Johnson Sioux reactors and make your own biology, we are becoming totally self-sufficient. And I think that's where this whole industry could head toward. Now, does a farm need to become 100% self-sufficient? Probably not. But they need to start digging into those inputs and decide where they can start peeling back and cutting down and start reducing the nitrogen and the P and the K and all of that.
Yeah, and just quickly, how long have you been in transition, Rick? How long ago did you start this journey?
We started no-till cover crop about 18 years ago. We started reducing inputs about what was it, about 14 years ago, but now it's been 10 years, almost 11, that we've had no fertility inputs, no seed treatments, no insecticides, no fungicides, no herbicides, none of that. We haven't done any of that for 10 or 11 years. So when you couple that system with no tillage, I'm telling you folks, this is hard. This is very, very hard, because we are now starting to get perennial plants that we can no longer mitigate. We can't suppress them. We can't suppress chicory. We can't suppress Canada goldenrod. We can't suppress Canada thistle. All of these things, but when you look at, and I heard sap analysis mentioned a little bit previous, awesome. It's awesome because you do a soil test and it says, wow, I got 3,000 parts per million of calcium in my profile. I ought to have plenty of calcium available for the plant. You pull a sap analysis on the plant and it's showing 50 parts per million. What's the problem here? So you won't know those things until you do that next step. But when you couple all of this together, then we can start to greatly reduce the need for synthetic inputs.
Yeah. So where does your fertility come from? And I guess I could ask. Yeah, go on.
The cover crops that we're growing, and I've changed my whole outlook on that. I mean, kind of yes, but kind of no. But when you look at, again, my number one priority is diversity. So when I look at diversity, I look at, okay, when a beginner needs to be using 1 to 2 species to get started with, and they probably should be a winter kill type species if they're in an environment that gets a freezing weather event. Now, diversity then would be to go from 2 species to 6 to 8 to 12 to 16. That's adding diversity. And that's what I used to preach and pound on the table really hard. But now what we're looking at is the families. You need to increase the number of families that you have in your cocktails. And a cocktail is a species, is a number of species that you put together that you go out and plant. So what we're now striving for on this farm is we are trying to build cocktails that have a minimum of 6 families in them. And when you start to do that, Richard, now you are truly turning on the microbial community through those different exudates that now make you extremely comfortable to start taking those inputs away, because the biological community is going to feed the crop that you are trying to grow.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love that. And coming across the pond to you, Anna, how have you seen your farm change as you've been on this journey? And perhaps you could tell us about, wildlife and diesel usage, and maybe even go on to water infiltration and things like that.
Yeah, so we're similar to Rick in that we've seen a big shift, and also we've not been going as long as Rick. So we sort of started our journey 9 years ago now, but we went in quite slowly because I actually wasn't even on the farm at the time when it started. Dad has told me, but basically we didn't go no-till straight away because we thought it would ruin the land in that it would make it really bumpy and we wouldn't be able to get sort of a clean, sort of even soil, as it were. So we went in slowly, and then we've been no-till now for about 5 years, but we haven't ploughed for like 9 years. Not that I'm demonizing the plough, because I think it does have a place, putting that out there. But yeah, basically our organic matter has increased by 1.8% over 10 years, which doesn't sound like a lot when you say like that, but that is an average. So some fields have gone up by 3%, and actually that is a lot. So when we started, I say this in the movie actually, but when we started, our soils sort of smelled like sewage. And I remember coming onto the farm and I remember smelling it and it being pretty disgusting, if I'm honest. But now and when you say this to people, you sound really silly and people don't really get it. But now when I smell the soil, it sort of smells sweet, which I don't think, when you talk to people who aren't farmers and you say that soil has a smell, they look at you like you're a bit crazy, but it does smell sweet. But basically we've also, the same as Rick, so we've halved our diesel usage. We've also halved our repair usage, which not many people think about, but we're using vehicles less. So our tractor does 1 hour per acre per year, and it's actually, some of the fields are actually less than an hour. Whereas we spoke to a local farmer near us, and they have about 2.5 hours per acre per year of one tractor usage, and often they have more tractors than we have. So we have one main tractor on our farm, and that is it. And obviously we are 1,000 acres, like, let's not forget that, and a lot of the farms around us are a lot bigger than we are. But we've also halved our labour costs as well. So I have a second job on the farm. Dad is actually the only full-time farmer. I'm part-time, and then we have Carl, who's also part-time, and we both have side jobs as well, but we love farming so much that obviously we want to keep farming as well. And it definitely doesn't pay as well as the other jobs, but we just love it, so we do it. But we've also, so the thing that actually I think I read in Gabe's Brown book, but please correct me if I'm wrong, is that there's bugs on the windscreen now, and there didn't used to be. And that's something which is really exciting, and we're seeing. And actually, Dad has increased the tree population by 4 hectares of additional woodland. And actually, we've noticed that. We've noticed things come in. We haven't used insecticide now for, I'm going to say, about 5 years. So probably when we went no-till. And we haven't needed it. We genuinely haven't. There's been no point. We had, when we used to grow oilseed rape, we probably could have used it 1 year, but no other crops have needed it. And it's just really exciting, to be honest. And I think I agree with everything Rick said. I think Rick and my dad need to sit down and have a chat, because we used to be organic and Dad still has PTSD from organic days. So I feel like he needs to sit down with someone like Rick that's had a similar journey to us, because we were conventional, then we were organic, then we became conventional, then we became regen. And if you name any crop or any animal, my dad has grown or harvested it. You wouldn't believe. But he won't go organic. And I think the difference for me is, I do know organic people that, and I'm not dissing organic, but their soil doesn't smell very nice. Whereas I feel like regen, you're not thinking about, oh, I need, certain things. You're actually, like Tim says, you're looking at the soil and being like, what does it need? How can I feed it? How can I help it? That sort of thing. So I think our journey to cover crops hasn't even started yet, because we have not grown a successful cover crop yet. We're trying, but we live in the north of England where it's really cold. So unless you get it in during harvest, it's not really going to grow very high. So yeah, there's lots of things that we're still establishing and learning, definitely. And we are not as far down the line as Rick, but we want to learn from people like Rick, who can sort of, and Tim as well, who can help us along the way.
Yeah, I think that's so important, everything you just said. And part of the learning as well, I hear a lot, especially in the UK, about ponding and water logging of soils. I was wondering, Tim, if you could talk to us a little bit about water infiltration, what that is, and how that has changed on your farm.
Well, your soil becomes a carbon sponge, so the more carbon you start to get into your soil, the more water you can infiltrate. So sort of when I started on my journey 15 years ago, it might be a bit more than that now, I'd probably do an inch of water every 6 minutes. Last year when we tested it, I was doing an inch of water in 30 seconds. And it's just the difference that soil's come on the journey. And then, we don't get ponding unless there's a drainage issue, because it just keeps on going. It doesn't matter how much water we have. It just keeps being infiltrated, and it just becomes that sponge. It's stored there for when the crop needs it. It's not going into our rivers and causing flooding. I'm not washing all my soil away, taking all those nutrients with it. You only have to look at any estuary, any country around the world. It's all full of soil. You can't go and shovel that back up. Soil is so precious. It's a farmer's most valuable resource, and people are just letting it float off, but taking all that nutrition with it, which then becomes a pollution angle, and then we're getting all these dead zones in our oceans. A lot of our air that we breathe comes from marine photosynthesis. We cannot keep polluting the planet like that. As the high conventional farmers, they're probably using 50% of the nitrogen that we put onto land. We've got to get better at producing and getting nature to do the job for us. The air that we breathe is 78% nitrogen. All we need is the microbes to convert that nitrogen for us. And I've had real good success with that. I've had some failures as well, which is why I sap test, I foliar test to see what's going on, and I do foliar applications. If I'm having a shortfall, I'll do a foliar application to keep that crop growing, because it is a photosynthesis machine. I don't want it to reduce in size. I want maximum leaf size so I can capture that sunlight, because that's all a farmer is harvesting sunlight all the while. But going back to the infiltration rates, they've just gone through the roof, but it's the same as my worm numbers. Last year when I tested the worms, I was getting 37 worms per square foot. You multiply that up per acre, it's something like 4.5 million worms per acre. They're aerating my soil, they're making nutrients available, they've got all those drainage channels which lets that water get in there, and it's all working just as nature intended. It's human beings that have always had this feeling that we've got to interfere, when it was working perfectly well for millions of years, till we came along and thought, we think we know better, and we didn't know better. It's nobody's fault, but now we've got to address the balance and start to work with nature, work in harmony with it.
Yeah. So coming back to you, Bertie, I think we've discussed some really interesting ways of how regenerative agriculture can help the nutrient richness of the grains that they're producing. Why do you think the barriers exist connecting, the Ricks, the Tims, the Annas of the world with the bread makers? And can you talk on, the millers' challenges? And I know, if I understand it correctly, a lot of big bread companies, they basically have multiple farmers who grow for them, and then the grain goes into a gigantic pile, and from that pile, it gets drawn and made into bread. And this idea of preserving the identity, I guess that potentially is a barrier for some of the larger millers. But can you talk on that a little bit more, just to help the listeners really understand the identity preservation importance of what Tim and Anna and Rick are doing, so that a consumer can connect to them and support them?
Yeah, absolutely. So flour millers in this whole journey have got a duty to be able to turn all of that hard work that all of these guys are doing into a product that's going to work and ideally be nutritious and taste great. That's the role. I've just spent the last week speaking to probably 20 different baking companies, and I've been having this very conversation with them. And what's the feedback that I'm getting? Some of the larger companies, very probably low knowledge, the view that it's going to be really expensive, and they are economies of scale type businesses. So we need to convert that thought process and talk a little bit more about the ultimate food security for them. Some of the small and mid-sized businesses have heard of Regen. They might have seen a good film like 6 Inches of Soil that a few people have heard about, or something like that. But it's still probably quite a small amount of knowledge. And even if they have heard of it, there might be a barrier of price. there are regen products being sold out there for really high prices, which is putting up another barrier that doesn't need to happen. Tim has spoken briefly about the type of yield he's been getting per hectare, up to 12 tonnes per hectare. And for those that don't know, that is pretty incredible. But not everybody can do that. So the first barrier is probably knowledge, and then once people have got that knowledge, removing the other barriers to make it work. Which, and I have to say, is price, and that goes to the consumer as well. We all want to think that consumers are going to make this decision, and maybe 10 to 20% will, but many won't, which is why we've got to make it affordable, but also profitable for farmers as well. So education is a key thing, price control is a key thing, and then I think another part of your question was about traceability. Our mill is 1,000 tonnes per annum. I do not know of any milling organisation above our size, which is most of them, that can give you 100% traceable supply chain back to the farm all the way to the baby can. And the reason is that our systems, big barns, big scale, big trucks, going into big mills with big flour silos, going in bulk to big factories. So it's very difficult on that scale. We are doing it on a smaller scale to the really large guys, where they customers can say and know exactly which farm that came from. Our challenge is going to be, how do we scale that to tens and tens of thousands of tons? We can do it on thousands, tens of thousands. So that's our barrier we've got to work on, and we've got to think about the price barrier, and we've also got to think about the knowledge barrier as well. We've got to do all of those things in conjunction with the farmers.
Yeah,
Richard,
scalability is. Sorry, go for it, Valley.
I love what Bertie said there, and I just would like to layer a couple things in here, if you don't mind. I think, you talked about price and price being a barrier. What I think the bigger barrier is, that's a more premium product. We as brands, I'm speaking on a brand's side here, we have to communicate what the value is to the consumer. And why that price is different. So I think the long-term goal is obviously to make food affordable. And now I'm like switching over from whiskey just to, regenerative sourcing and regenerative foods. But, the long-term goal obviously is that, right, the right incentives are in place, and regenerative nutrient dense food is affordable for everyone. But it's also an unlearning, right? We've been accustomed that we have to eat these, mass amounts of quantities of food. And from a science standpoint, like we probably do. I mean, all of us probably on this call are taking supplements of some sort because we're not getting that nutrient in our food anymore. So when we start talking about the value to the consumer of a regeneratively grown or raised food product, we also need to communicate you're getting more nutrients in this. You're getting more satiation with smaller amounts of this product. So a lot of the education, I think, is the ownership is really going to be on brands, and communicating what that value might be a little bit more premium of a price, but what is the value that you're getting? You can consume less. You're supporting profitability of growers. I mean, farmers are our heroes. They feed the world. So I think, bringing, the value and what that dollar goes to is going to be a lot of ownership of the brands. But something else I also wanted to touch on that you said with, how do you connect and really segregate these premium products all the way to the end consumer? And for our industry specifically, that's where I think Maker's Mark is a little bit different, is because we have that direct relationship with our corn and wheat growers. We were able to help them, make some of these transitions and help, really partner with the growers on the types of changes that we want to see in the practices of the agriculture, obviously knowing that the farmer is the expert here. But even in our industry, most distillers have no idea where their grains are coming from. They're sourcing to a spec from a grain supplier. And I think there's a huge role for suppliers, right? But like, how can we kind of include maybe some of that transparency? How can we encourage spirits brands or any brands to really understand, yes, you can source from a supplier, like maybe that is the right solution, but how do you also know the end farmer? Because that's only going to help the quality of the product. That's going to help, bring these right practices to life. And I think brands need to understand, the challenges and also the benefits of knowing the grower.
Yeah, I think that's really important. The human health aspect is vital. And I'd like, Rick, I really would be interested for you to share your diabetes journey, if that's
Mhm.
okay, because I think that story is pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Valerie a question first, if I could.
Sure.
Valerie, how many large companies think like you folks do in this regenerative space? Is it a growing number? Is it stagnating? I mean, what's happening?
I, I think there's a lot of fear. I think price is a fear for a lot of large organizations, to that point, like, can we afford to do this when a consumer isn't asking for this?
Yeah,
Maker's Mark, we are so fortunate to, be led by the grandson of the founders, Rob Samuels. The Samuels have all been visionaries and kind of see where the future is going, as opposed to kind of following where the industry has been. So I think it's through, Rob's leadership and really pushing that this is not only the right thing to do for business, but the right thing to do for the future is unique for our industry. But we're hoping that this becomes a spark. It's a catalyst. Like, can we be an example for others? And then it makes it easier for others to go on this journey because somebody has pioneered and, really started that path. So we're hoping to see others come along, and we're certainly sharing our journey. Like I said, not perfect here, learning a lot as we go, but encouraging others that we can lead the way.
that's awesome. Thank you. Yeah, Richard, you asked about the diabetes. This is truly self-inflicted. My diet was not the way it should have been when I was younger. I basically, yes, thank you. Thank you very much. Um, yeah, the diabetes, and I'm type 2 diabetic. I feel like it's self-inflicted. I have basically eaten my way into being a diabetic, and it was kind of, it's kind of funny when you're younger. We're all impervious to everything, right? When you're 18, 19, 20 years old, nothing's going to slow us down. And you kind of make jokes, about, gosh, if I keep drinking these, and I better not mention the products, but if I keep drinking these sodas, could I become diabetic? Well, here we are. So when I look back at the diet that I had, the liquids that I was consuming, there's no reason why I wasn't diabetic. Now I'm very active. I get a lot of exercise. Being a farmer, it's just comes with the job. But when you now really start to understand how important health is, because when you don't have it, then you realize how critical a healthy body is. Well, there was
Yeah.
a time when I didn't have that healthy body, and I'm like, holy cow, what's going on here? I've never had these issues before. So then you really start to dive into the food you're eating. So it's just kind of like what Tim was talking about. It's just kind of the same thing when you think about this. So, and I don't know how deep you want me to go here, but I'm lined up to have some surgery, okay? And I'm getting ready to go into this operating room, and the head nurse comes in and she says, "Let me check your blood sugar. I see no one's done that." I'm like, "Okay, whatever, And she pricks my finger and she reads the first read. She's like, "Holy cow, that can't be right." She throws it in the trash and does it again, and I'm like, "Whoo!" I'm like and that she hits the button and it's like code blue and everyone is coming into the room, So now all of a sudden
Wow.
your life has just been upended. Okay. And the next thing I did was you go and see an endocrinologist. Then the second thing you do is you go see a nutritionist. And now the nutritionist is going to teach you on how to eat. This is the same thing we're talking about, the education to the soil. We need those mentors, those ambassadors to teach the farmers how to change their soil and become healthy again. This is all parallel to a human like you can't believe. So long story short, now that I have got on a better road of a diet and better healthy food. I mean, when my wife goes to the grocery store to shop, she's there for 3 hours because she is looking at every product's label. And number one on the list is organic. That's the number one. If you can't go organic, then you start reading what are the ingredients in that product. And then when you start to do this, and I can luckily say today, guys, that I am not on any medication. I am not on
Wow.
any insulin. Yeah. So I mean that is huge. And people need to get blood work done every single year. It's imperative. And
Yeah.
I look at a blood draw the same way as pulling a sap analysis or pulling a soil sample from the field. Okay, it is a snapshot in time. What is the trend of organic carbon in the soil profile? What is the trend of inorganic nitrogen in the soil profile? What is the trend of your blood sugar? So you have to understand that I can take my sugar count right now and it might be 110, but if I go eat lunch and then go to the doctor and have a blood draw, it's going to be 175. So we have to understand why the levels are where they are, and that's why I highly recommend the soil testing, the sap analysis, collect that data, put it into a spreadsheet, and watch what the trend is over time. And that's
Yeah.
and guys, I'm going to tell you, it probably was a good thing that I've been diagnosed when I was, because I've changed my eating habits. I've changed the diet. Do I still fall off the wagon? Oh yeah, I still do that. But you know what? I'm going to go back to a comment that was made earlier about the moldboard plow. Now, I'm not promoting a moldboard plow here, but I'm going to make an analogy. When we are in these systems that we are creating, and let's just stay with my system because I don't know everyone's system as well as you know your own. So we're going to just talk about mine. When we are on a trajectory of cover crop no-till for 18 years, and now you couple 10 years of no chemistry, nothing that ends in CIDES, no sides, no herbicides, insecticides, pesticides. When you take all that away and you've done it as long as we have, now what we're going to do, and I'm sorry, I'm kind of blowing off here, but I got something that came in and I got to get it out. We are now, what we're going to do is we're going to baseline where our farm is now with PLFA, a soil test, microbiome analysis, biome makers out of California, and probably some DNA sequencing. And we're going to do a tillage event. And I'm going to see how quick the system can bounce back from one tillage event 3 inches deep. Okay. My bet is that when you are on a regenerative system trajectory and you introduce an event like a one-time event like that, your system will bounce back very quickly. So are you harming your system are you no longer regenerative then? I don't think so. So we have to be careful how we define what regenerative is. Okay. And I'm going to have some evidence on this a year from now. So, but I'm just speaking out of what my gut tells me is going to happen here. But I look at the same thing as being diabetic. Do we have to be only eating this and only doing this every single meal. I don't think so. I think you can veer off and have a piece of cake at a birthday party. You can veer off and do whatever, and then you come back in. And what I'm seeing is I wear sensors on the back of my arm that tell me what my levels are all the time. So what I'm seeing now is the same thing I'm seeing in the soil. When I consume a sugar, my numbers spike and they fall right back down. That's exactly what's happening in the soil. So the parallels here are uncanny. Yes,
I was
Valerie.
just going to say, like, I think there's so much misinformation about what organic is and what regenerative is. And I think, Rick, what you just said there is the reason, we've become so passionate about regenerative is it's doing what's best for the soil. And it's building that longevity where, in contrast, for example, what I understand of organic is it's, a set of rules and, and criteria. And, the thing I love about regenerative is the first principle of regenerative is context. So where are you? What are you growing? What does the soil need? What does the land need? And I think that's just, it's such a freedom, I think, for farmers, as, if we have farmers listening, of thinking about getting into this space is, there's this beauty of this harmony with the agriculture that doesn't necessarily follow a strict playbook. So anyways, I thought that was like a great connection if there's farmers listening kind of questioning, this regenerative journey versus organic. It's a very different journey.
Yes. And I want to also add to that is you're exactly right, Valerie. We have to learn how to meet people in their context. And that context means so many things. It's not just where are you in the world? Where are you in the journey? Where are you in comfort? How comfortable are you stepping out of this system you're in and changing? That's where we have to learn and educate our teachers to meet everyone where they are in their context. That's exactly right.
And I think that's right. Even Richard, you started the podcast with, from a buyer lens, like when you're at shelf, what does a consumer care? And I think that context and where you meet the consumer, introducing them to the benefits of regenerative agriculture. That's the other thing about the beauty of regenerative agriculture is you could be coming at this from, a million different directions, whether it be flavor. Obviously, that's how Maker's Mark stumbled into this, is like, I just want a better flavored product that, that I'm buying. It could be,
or different.
so it's flavor. It could be I'm eating now for nutrients, to Rick's point in his story with the diabetes, or it could be like, I care about farmers, or I care about the environment. So I think like just the more you understand about regenerative, there's really something for everybody, especially, at the consumer level, to care about this space. Obviously you're getting the benefits of all of it, but maybe you're buying brands that are, or things that have been grown with a sustainable mindset or that are beneficial to the environment. Regenerative is that for you as well.
I love that. That's so true. Rick, Rick.
I want to ask Valerie another question. I hope this is okay. Valerie, you don't have to answer this if you don't want to. How have you seen Maker's Mark sales since you have gone 100%? You're 100% regenerative, right? 100% on all your input.
86%. So we're working on the barley right now. Yeah.
86%. That's a lot. How have you seen sales? Has that affected sales?
Well, like I said, we have a long journey to get this actually, the certification on the bottle, just because of the roughly 7 years aging on the liquid. Yep. Where I think the impact has come, certainly consumers interested in this space. But I think what we're most proud of, Rick, is the impact that we're having on the growing community and the impact we're having on, the media are really interested in this conversation. Like this is a very different way to think about bourbon and think about growing. And we know from our partnership with Regenerative that after our announcement, there were multiple brands interested in this journey. And the acreage that Regenerative is verifying has more than doubled since our announcement. So we know that this is having true impact. And yes, we're excited about the flavor of the bourbon improving over time and what that means for our growers that pass, their practices down from generation to generation. But we're really excited about the megaphone that we can have on agriculture globally.
I love it. And Bertie, what about you in terms of your sales? Have you seen that change as you've gone on this journey? Oh, I can't hear you. Bertie, I can't hear you. No. Well, whilst you sort that out, Annie, we've only got a couple more minutes left. I can't hear you yet. Anna, a quick question for you before we finish. You're obviously a voice of the next generation, which is really important. And I was curious how you've been able to kind of engage the hearts and minds of, your generation to come into farming and find this something that's exciting and interesting. How do you see that from your perspective?
I think it's difficult to bring people into farming because I think there's becoming less and less jobs in farming. But there are people like AD who's a vegetable grower, and like I know that she's bringing more people in. I was actually talking to someone about this the other day, and we have a beekeeper on the farm, and he gives us honey in exchange for rent, basically. And I think there's going to be more sort of exchanges like that on our farm. I think we've been burnt quite a lot in the past when we've done sort of financial trades and it's hurt us. Whereas I think going forward, doing trades where it makes sense for them, like we need the bees, if we can get some honey, we can then sell that. We have the Pink Pig farm, which is we have like a cafe, restaurant, farm park on site, so we can then sell that in that as well, and it's all on site and it's all local. So I think that's really good, but I think farming jobs are just hard to come by. But I do think keep trying if you are trying and keep pushing and just get to know some farmers. Farmers are often lonely actually. So if you want to go and have a chat with a farmer, they probably won't say no. But I think also getting young people into the space. So I do a lot on sort of TikTok and social media and things like that, and just start open conversations. And I think a lot of the questions I get asked are actually by non-farmers. And it's actually great because the other day, we were struggling. I put online about the positives that happen, but I also put about the struggles that happen because I think a lot of farmers look at other farmers and think everything's perfect, and it's actually really not. I mean, we have sheep, so it's never perfect. Like you can't. They're just
Yeah.
but I think like often I'll get advice from other farmers as well, and they'll sort of comment and be like, "Oh, actually, we did this. This was really good. Would recommend this." So, like for example, our wheat at the moment, we've just direct drilled it into grass, which was the previous year we grew grass for seed, and we've direct drilled it in, and this is my third attempt at drilling the field, and stuff is coming up, but it's not very happy. So I think it's those sort of challenges that actually social media is actually quite good for, and bringing in young ideas. So I always say to dad, like, I have so many ideas that I want to implement. But again, if I throw them at him all at once, it would end badly. So I think it's slowly, especially for my generation, like, don't get frustrated when if you're like me, I want to do everything all at once and I want to change the world tomorrow because I feel as passionate about the environment as I'm sure everyone else does on this podcast. But you can't do it all at once. And I think that's something I'm learning is the patient word, which I absolutely hate. But I think we do need to learn it. So yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, I'm excited for the future of regenerative. Like I think it's a really, really open, fun space to be in. I'm listening to Nicole Masters' book at the moment, and she sort of says like you need to be ready to like change your whole herd tomorrow. You need that kind of open mindset, and I think like that's what a lot of regenerative farmers have, and they have that sort of open, welcoming, thinking mindset, which actually we need at the moment in this world to sort of
Totally.
around.
Yeah, I think there's historically been no better time than today to really connect with farmers and where you get your food from, and really understanding that milk doesn't come from a bottle in the supermarket. It actually comes from a cow, and bread does come from a farmer somewhere who's grown that grain. But I think that's a really good point. And with that, we're going to draw things to a close today. We could talk about this for hours and hours. And thank you all so much for your time. We're going to put in the podcast notes the contact details of everybody, so you can reach out directly if you wish to, through the 6 Inches of Soil Instagram feed. We'll put our contact details for that too. But thank you all so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor.